What's going on, guys? This is a follow-up video to a video I made about 8 weeks ago. In this video, we're going to discuss some of the questions and concerns that arose from part 1, and then we're also going to take a closer look at the process of transitioning away from tracking. So for me, before I first experimented with not tracking after I had learned to track, one of the biggest barriers that prevented me from doing that was I thought that if I didn't track, I either wouldn't be able to achieve my goals at all, or I thought that I wouldn't be able to achieve them as efficiently as I would if I was tracking. And one important distinction that helped me kind of get around that was I realized that tracking itself does not result in progress. Tracking is just a tool to help guide our behaviors, and that it is the behaviors themselves that determine our progress, not whether we write them down or not. So if you like the idea of not tracking, if you're in a similar situation to where I was, if you like the idea of not tracking, but you're concerned that you won't be able to achieve your goals without doing it, I think that's a very valid concern, because there are a lot of goals out there where it absolutely makes sense to track. Even though tracking isn't necessary, it's definitely beneficial for a lot of goals, depending on your nutritional knowledge or your level of motivation, because tracking definitely provides accountability. Or if the precision of your goal, if it's a very high level of precision that you need to have with your nutritional intake. In those situations, it makes sense that we would want to track. And to the flip side, it also makes sense that if we already had behaviors in place that support our goals, if we already have a good understanding of food when it comes to, we know about the nutrient composition of a lot of different foods, if our goal, the level of precision for our goal, we don't need to be as precise with our intake, it would make sense that there are also goals that we don't need to track. So if you like the idea of not tracking, and objectively speaking, you have assessed your goals and they are achievable without tracking. So for example, you're trying to maintain a body weight that you would probably maintain anyway based on your current behaviors and lifestyle, regardless of whether you wrote it down. So if you like the idea of not tracking, and objectively speaking, achieving your current goals is possible without tracking, then I would ask yourself these questions. If you're still kind of concerned that I just don't know if I'll be able to do it. How long have you been tracking? Do you know the nutrient composition of most of your habitual foods? Do you have similar eating patterns on a day-to-day basis? Do you value your health? Do you have compelling strength and or physique goals that will influence what and how you eat, regardless of whether you write it down or not? Do you already have well-established behaviors that support your health and goals? Do you really need to track your macronutrient or calorie intake? So here was one of the comments that arose from the previous video. Could have used examples of what physically hungry means. Is there a different type of hunger? Mental? How do we use those non-physical feedback signals? What if you're bloated and thus not physically feeling hungry, but mentally your brain knows you need food? So shout out to Adam. These are all great questions. In this video, we're going to take a close look at the first question. The second question I will cover in future content, and then the third question we'll look at in part 3. So the reason I specified physically hungry is because the longer and more heavily we rely on external feedback to guide our decision making on what, when, and how much to eat, typically the further away we get from being able to recognize our body's feedback to us. We don't lose touch with the extremes, so at the far end of the scale, both, let's say, ravenous and stuffed, eventually, no matter how much we're relying on external feedback to guide our intake, eventually the intensity of the sensations reaches a point where we can no longer ignore them. So we don't necessarily lose touch with the extremes. However, it's those physiological states in the middle, that 3 to 8 range, that become harder to recognize. And for those who didn't see part 1, 3 to 8 is a reference to a hunger and fullness scale that we covered in that video, which I will link in the description box below. So this decreased ability to recognize the subtler sensations of hunger and fullness can make it easier to eat for reasons other than being physically hungry. So the reason, again, I specified tuning into those physical hunger and fullness sensations is that we're trying to ignore any environmental cues. So let's say you're at work and you see a cookie on the table, or it's noon and every day for the last 5 years you've eaten lunch at noon. So you're trying to kind of ignore the environmental cues, and you're also trying to ignore your current emotional state. So if you're anxious, if you're bored, if you're lonely, and you're really trying to tune into those hunger and fullness sensations, that is the goal of what I meant by that statement. So what a perfect transition to discuss some of the different hunger sensations. So lightheaded, headache, you may get growling noises in your stomach, you may experience bubbling in your stomach, potentially mild to intense stomach pain, difficulty concentrating, or irritability. So 2 important things to note are that not everyone will experience all of these sensations when they're hungry, and these sensations can occur across a spectrum of intensities. So said differently, hunger feels different to different people. My hunger may feel different than your hunger. So if we just look at me as one example, I don't get lightheaded, I don't get a headache, I do get growling noises in my stomach, I do get bubbling in my stomach, I very rarely get stomach pain, and even when I'm extremely hungry, it's more of a burning sensation rather than a pain. Concentrating, as I get hungrier, my concentration goes up until the point where I reach a certain intensity of hunger to where my concentration actually goes down. And then irritability, very rarely unless I'm really lean. So fullness sensations, kind of, or like I touched on, like we covered a little bit like a few minutes ago, even when we're relying heavily on external feedback, we never really lose touch with what it feels like to be sick from eating too much. The intensity of those sensations is so extreme that it doesn't matter, you're not going to be able to ignore them. So versus discussing all of those sensations that all of us can identify anyways, I figure it would be better to talk about what it feels like to be satisfied. And it's something that I shoot for, but I never really put it to words until I sat down to make this video, and I was like, man, that's a hard thing to do. Like, how do you describe being satisfied? Because I can easily describe what it feels like to be stuffed, and I can give you sensations for what it feels like to be hungry, but how do I describe being satisfied? So here are 2 things. The first thing is the feeling of something in your stomach. So if you were to kind of go inside and think, and you could potentially feel food in your stomach, so the physical feeling of something in your stomach. And then the second thing is the alleviation of the hunger sensations you were previously experiencing. So let's say you were having difficulty concentrating, you were irritable, and you were having growling noises in your stomach. So the state of being satisfied would be the alleviation of those sensations. So again, if I had to describe what satisfied feels like in 2 words, I would say not hungry. And then, like we already talked about, hunger and fullness sensations are individual, which means they must be experienced. So a lot of you watching this video are very familiar with the different sensations you can feel when you're training. You're very familiar with the difference between when you're stimulating a muscle and joint pain. You're familiar with, you're able to differentiate when the pain you're experiencing or the pain you're experiencing is appropriate and when it's a warning sign. Let's say that I had never lifted weights before and I asked you to describe to me what it feels like to stimulate a muscle. we could sit here all day and you could try to guide me in the right direction, but ultimately to truly know what that feels like, I would have to experience it myself. I would either have to go to the gym and do a set of curls or fall to the ground and start doing push-ups, but to truly know what that felt like, what stimulating a muscle feels like, I would have to experience it. And hunger sensations and fullness sensations are the same thing. The hunger and fullness sensations we just covered will point you in the right direction, but ultimately you have to actually experience these different levels of hunger while paying attention to how you feel to truly know what different levels of hunger and fullness feel like for you. So it's not that, like, obviously, it's not that we've never experienced different levels of hunger and fullness before. Like, you've experienced all the levels of hunger and full, maybe not all of them, but you've experienced a wide range of levels of hunger and fullness. It's just when you rely heavily on external feedback, you're just not paying attention. Like, we just don't pay attention to it because our focus is somewhere else. Our focus is on numbers and it's not on the feeling. So the point now is you're paying attention while you're experiencing these different sensations and these different levels of hunger and fullness. And this leads to kind of the last major topic of this video. And constantly having to rate my hunger and fullness would make me freak out in a matter of days. I'd much rather keep tracking my food normally on a daily and leave auto-regulation strategies for when I'm traveling or on vacation/holiday. And this is another really good point, and I think further clarification will alleviate a lot of concerns. So there will absolutely be a period of time where you invest more time and more mental effort to learn the skill of being able to identify the different hunger and fullness sensations, the different levels of hunger and fullness. However, it gets easier over time. It's very similar to tracking. We often forget about the initial investment that we made to learn how to track. We had to learn how to use a food scale. We had to learn how to use MyFitnessPal. We had to learn the nutrient composition of all these different foods. We had to learn whether the nutrition facts label on chicken breast was for cooked or uncooked chicken. We had to learn all this stuff, and imagine if you'd never taken the time to learn all of that and you were still following a rigid meal plan, eating the same 10 foods every 2.5 hours, 6 times a day. The freedom that you experience when you transition away from precisely tracking everything you eat all the time to something like a more intuitive approach is where you're not tracking all the time, that the freedom you experience when you do that is very similar to the freedom you experienced whenever you transition from a rigid meal plan to having a calorie target. So I would shy away from this approach too if I thought every day for the rest of my life, every time I sat down to eat, I'd have to spend 20 minutes to assess how hungry I am. And then the final point is the hunger and fullness scale. So the point with the hunger and fullness scale is its purpose is to help us learn to identify the different hunger and fullness sensations and to give us a framework to be able to rank the different sensations and to rank the intensity of those sensations. So that the scale helps to give us that initial framework and the number helps us to develop and kind of learn what this stuff feels like. But eventually the numbers fall away. Because if we think about, like, just for example, like tracking, like for a lot of people, if they've never tracked before and they start tracking their intake, then that brings an awareness to the eating process where before they may have just been kind of mindfully eating. So this hunger and like paying attention to your hunger and fullness signals and using this scale brings an awareness to the eating process, just a different awareness than what tracking gives you. So the point I was making was that you don't use that scale forever. Like if I look at my situation and how I do things now, I use that scale initially because the numbers help, but now that I'd kind of gone through that period, I don't think about the numbers at all anymore. The numbers have just fallen away and I focus just on sensations. So for example, like in that last video, I talk about, my strategy of kind of staying between a 3 and a 7.5. it's not that I'm sitting here recording a video and then I'm like, oh, there's a 3, time to do something. It's more like I'm doing something and I notice that I'm having difficulty concentrating, my performance starts going down, and then I'm like, oh shoot, I should probably eat something, like my performance is going down. And so it's at this point, I'm really just paying attention to the feelings I'm experiencing versus like sitting here being like, okay, is that a 2.5 or a 3 or a 3.5? And obviously the sensations aren't the only, that's not the only thing I use to guide my decisions in terms of what to eat or how to eat. But that is we'll touch more on all of that stuff in part 3. So yeah, so that is it for this video. In part 3, we will we'll take a closer look at how you can achieve your strength and physique goals without tracking. I'll see you guys in part 3.